Thank you very much. It's great to join you here today. In the brief time we've got, I just want to give you a little bit of a snapshot of how I began campaigning and a couple of the issues I'm currently working on. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952. My first campaign was when I was 15 in 1967 in my hometown of Melbourne, Australia. A man who escaped from prison was due to be hanged for allegedly shooting dead a prison warder during his escape. But I worked out at the age of 15 that from the autopsy report, which showed the trajectory of the bullet through the dead warder's body, from where the escaped warder was standing, or the escaped prisoner was standing, and where the shot warder was standing, it would have been almost physically impossible for the convict to have fired the fatal shot. But that man was hanged anyway, despite disputed evidence. And that made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. I thought to myself, if people in power, the government, the police, and the courts, can hang a man where there is evidence that he possibly or probably was not guilty, what else are they doing in our name? So I began to look at the historic abuse of Indigenous Australians, the black Aboriginal peoples, who were dispossessed of their land from the period of English colonisation in 1788 onwards. I began questioning Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. Now, I would recommend you to watch the BBC4 series, The Vietnam War. The first 2 episodes were this week. The next 8 episodes are over the subsequent weeks. Please watch it. It's an absolutely extraordinary story of how a supposedly democratic government, the United States, was dragged into a war where they propped up dictatorship and engaged in mass human rights abuses. So watch it, because it is a warning from history. It's a warning that we must never allow governments to have a carte blanche, a blank check. We must always question government, always question policies, always look at the evidence and check whether it stacks up. So I became a champion, an advocate of Indigenous Australian civil and land rights, an opponent of the war in Vietnam, and when I was 17 and realised I was gay, also an advocate for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender equality. Nothing in my background prepared me, because I had no models, no template, no mentors. So what I did was I looked at history. I looked at examples in history of successful human rights campaigns, such as that by Mahatma Gandhi and the struggle for Indian independence against British colonial rule, such as the struggle of the suffragettes who campaigned for votes for women, and such as the black civil rights movement in America, where they campaigned against voting denial and segregation of public places. I looked at those examples. I looked at the values, the ideals, the methods, the techniques they used, and applied them to my own human rights work. And so, just to give you a very quick snapshot of a few things I've done over the years, in 1973, I staged the first ever protest for LGBT rights in a communist country, in what was then the communist half of Germany, the German Democratic Republic. I was arrested, interrogated, and bullied by the secret police. Some years later, as you've heard, I stood in the Bermondsey by-election in 1983 as a Labour candidate. Because I was on the left and because I was gay, I was subjected to an horrendous campaign of harassment and violence. When out canvassing on the doorsteps, seeking people's votes, I was physically assaulted over 150 times, including 2 attempts to run me down in a car. On top of that, there were over 30 attacks upon my flat, including bricks and bottles through the windows, and even a bullet through my front door. Many commentators say it was probably the dirtiest, most violent by-election in Britain in the 20th century. But I survived. I lost the election, but I survived. And that experience redoubled my resolve to champion human rights. A bit later, some years later, I helped organize the world's first ever HIV human rights conference to defend the human rights of people with AIDS and HIV, which in those days, in the 1980s, governments, including the British government, were very, very negative. We're not providing the support and the funding for people with the virus. And there was big talk about increasing repression, including quarantining people with HIV against their will. That conference and the subsequent, we had a big mass candlelit march through central London, resulted in the World Health Ministers Summit in 1988, eventually coming out with a declaration against discrimination and calling on governments to work with people with HIV and marginalized communities to produce a collaborative effort to conquer that terrible disease. A bit later on, in 1994, together with my colleagues from the LGBT rights group Outrage, we outed 10 Anglican bishops. These were bishops of the Church of England who were gay, but were part of a church that was anti-gay. So we didn't out them because they were gay. We outed them because they were hypocrites and homophobes. They were supporting a church which was opposed to LGBT human rights. Now, it's one thing for people of faith to believe that homosexuality is wrong, but it's something altogether different for them to say that gay people should, by law, not have equality. And that's what the church was saying, and those bishops are part of that church, so that's why we named them. The consequence was that none of those bishops ever again, as far as I know, made any anti-gay comments. And 2 of them eventually became great allies of the LGBT community. A bit later, in 1999, myself and 3 other members of Outrage, the LGBT group, we ambushed the President of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, in London. We ran in front of his motorcade, forcing it to halt, in protest against the human rights abuses by his regime. Even though we had evidence that he'd authorized torture of critics, even though we had that evidence, and even though British and international law says condoning or acquiescing in torture is a crime, we were arrested, whereas President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. 2 years later, in 2001, I repeated the attempt, only this time I was by myself because I couldn't get anybody to come with me. I went to Belgium, to Brussels, and ambushed President Mugabe in the lobby of the Hilton Hotel, again seeking his arrest on charges of torture, contrary to Belgian and international human rights law. I was set upon by his bodyguards. I got within about 3 or 4 feet of him, but I was set upon by his bodyguards and eventually beaten unconscious and left in the gutter. But both these attempted citizens' arrests of President Mugabe, although they did not succeed, they did promote media coverage which highlighted the abuses of his regime. And particularly when I was so badly beaten, and it's caused me some permanent brain and eye damage, especially when I was so badly beaten in Brussels in 2001, everybody concluded if President Mugabe is prepared to have his bodyguards beat up a peaceful protester in the heart of a European capital city, in broad daylight, in front of the police and in front of the world's media, just imagine what he's doing to his own people when no one is watching. So it was that effectiveness in terms of raising awareness. In 2002, Mike Tyson, the boxer, had been making very homophobic remarks about Lennox Lewis, the British boxer who was due to fight him. And he'd made a whole series of really vicious, nasty, homophobic slurs. So I went to Memphis, where the title fight was being held. I found out where Mike Tyson was training, and I lay in wait outside his training camp. And when he arrived, I ambushed him and challenged him over his homophobia. I can remember now that when I challenged him and confronted him, he clenched his fist, and I thought he was going to punch me. But then he saw there were TV cameras, and he put his fist down. But he was like really, really angry, really, really angry. And I said, look, if you're saying you didn't mean to be homophobic, then please don't be homophobic, and please say something to show you're not homophobic. So Mike Tyson then turned to the TV cameras and said, I'm against discrimination against gay people. Fantastic. No other boxer at that time, and I doubt since, has ever said something so explicit. So he did acknowledge that what he said was wrong, even though he claimed he didn't really mean it. And then he did make a positive statement in support of LGBT rights. Very quickly, I just wanted to sort of give you a flavour of some of the campaigns that we do. A very big campaign we run is about free speech. The importance of allowing people to have their say, even if we disagree with them. Now, that doesn't mean to say they should be given a free ride. So if they're racist or anti-Muslim or anti-Semitic or homophobic, biphobic or transphobic, of course, no one should be given a free pass. They should be challenged. But the best way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas. You know, to counter those ideas with evidence is far more effective than banning people or platforming them. Now, as you know, there's been a big debate within the National Union of Students over whether people should be no-platformed, and the National Union of Students has a policy that 6 quite extreme organisations are not permitted to speak on student union premises. And these include far-right organisations like the British National Party and far-right Islamist organisations like Hizb ut-Tahrir. But otherwise, they say people should be allowed to have their point of view, and of course they should be challenged. The Allied policy is called safe spaces, where the purpose is to create an atmosphere where people feel free to speak. So obviously we don't want people being intimidated because of their race or their faith or their sexuality. We want everybody to feel open and welcome and able to participate. So that aspect of safe spaces is really good. But sometimes both the no platform and the safe space policy is interpreted in a very restrictive way. So take Germaine Greer, the feminist icon. I don't agree with her about trans people. I think she's fundamentally wrong, and I'm really, really sad she takes an anti-trans position. But I don't think that banning her is the right, appropriate response. I think the better response is to let her speak and then challenge her, to give trans people a platform to tell their stories, to challenge what she's saying. For me, freedom of speech is one of the most important and precious of all human rights. You know, people died to defend free speech. Bruno Guadagno was burned at the stake for expressing views that conflicted with the Catholic Church a few centuries ago. You think about Galileo Galilei. He was excommunicated from the Catholic Church for 400 years for daring to suggest a different understanding of the universe as was taught by the Catholic Church in those days. Likewise, so many people throughout history have said very important things which many people have found offensive. Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Richard Dawkins. There are lots of people out there who say things that some people find offensive. But I don't think there's a right to not be offended. I think we have to have a contest of ideas. We have to challenge ideas. We have to think them through. We have to provide evidence and counter-evidence. So there's only 3 circumstances where I think that restrictions on free speech are justifiable. The first is that when someone says something that's demonstrably untrue and damaging. So, for example, if I falsely accused one of your teachers of being a paedophile, that was a false allegation, then I shouldn't be allowed to say that. That's not free speech, that's an abuse of free speech. Or if I said someone, a politician was a tax fraudster, and that was untrue, that's not what free speech is about. So that's one red line. The second is when people engage in speech that is threatening, menacing, persistently abusive, and amounts to harassment. Again, that's an abuse of free speech, which is not acceptable. And the final red line is incitements to violence. If someone incites violence against another person or group of people, that inhibits free speech because those people don't feel able to speak out because they fear the consequences. So in those three instances, I think it is legitimate to put some restrictions on free speech, but otherwise challenge and protest. So I supported the protests at Oxford University against Germaine Greer. I didn't support her being banned, but I did support the protests against her. I think that is the way to go. Finally, very briefly, my Human Rights Foundation runs the world's first and only LGBT Muslim Solidarity campaign. Our campaign is designed to encourage dialogue and understanding between the LGBT community and the Muslim community. And the basis of that is very simple. Although anti-Muslim prejudice and anti-LGBT prejudice are different, they're both forms of prejudice. The Muslim community and the LGBT community both suffer prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime. So our view is that we should be working together to fight hate crime, fight prejudice, fight discrimination. That whatever differences we can have those differences, but let's work together to protect and defend both our communities. And in particular, we want to defend lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Muslims who are often victimized by other members of the Muslim community. Not always. There are some great Muslim parents who accept their LGBT sons and daughters. There are some great LGBT Muslim spokespeople. The LGBT group Imam organizes LGBT Muslims. We've got some fantastic Muslim members of parliament, all but one of whom voted for same-sex marriage. So we mustn't generalize and stereotype Muslim people, but we do need to challenge homophobia within that community because, sadly, quite a high proportion or significant proportion of young Muslim people are rejected by their families. Some are thrown out on the streets when they're just teenagers. They're left destitute and homeless because their parents cannot accept their sexuality or their gender identity. There are a small number of very extremist Islamist clerics who preach against gay people, saying we should be put to death. That quite clearly is not acceptable. People can hold a view, that's fine, but to publicly say that gay people should be put to death, that is crossing a red line. So I think I'll finish there and leave it open to you to ask some questions. Thank you.